What's up? How y'all doing? It's Jared. It's Maxace&midnightcat Studios Amber 2, and that is Zermascus, right? Zirconium Damascus. It does not do any justice on camera. Trust me. This is beautiful. It's kind of like Damascus, looks a lot like Damascus, except it's darker. You can kind of see the etching there more. It's got a lot of texture to it. It's just beautiful, right? I really like that. When I first got this knife in, right? Well, same thing. If you're familiar with the Amber 1, right? Because when I first got this in here, this is an Amber 1 from MidnightCat Studios. I was looking on the inside of this knife, the inside track of this knife. You can see that little wavy line there? What is going on? I mean, how is this thing made? I had to take it apart. It's actually like dovetailed, right? It's like a dovetail fitting in between the actual scale itself and this backspacer. And I thought that was cool, you know? And so it's the same thing with this thing. I'm looking over this knife. This is just a titanium integral frame lock, right? There isn't a whole lot of craziness that can actually happen here. But if you look at the inside of this, there's a bearing race. You see that? If I can actually get this right there. There's a bearing track on either side. There's a bearing race on either side of this thing, and they're actually sunken. They're milled into the titanium, the actual frame itself. And so I'm sitting here like, wait, how did they do that? You know what I mean? How do you mill out a bearing race, or, you know, a track for a bearing race on the inside of a titanium integral frame lock? Because you can see here the actual lock bar. The actual lock bar interface, it does have a steel lock bar interface, but it's exterior. It's on the outside. And this is because they couldn't get, you know, that absolutely perfect milling down on the inside of this lock bar to fit that in there. And so they did it on the outside, which I think aids to the overall aesthetic of this knife. I love the way that that thing freaking looks. It's beautiful, right? What I'm going to do is actually use my chopstick here. I filed down a chopstick to fit in there basically perfectly, so it doesn't overextend the lock bar, but it'll keep tension off of the actual blade while I'm working here, so I can get this thing apart easier. Just take this little if I can actually watch what I'm doing here. Take it out. I love taking apart an integral just because it's freaking easy. There's one screw, right? And now look at that. I'm already looking at this thing like, wait, what is that? Like, how does that work? You know what I mean? This is steel, you know what I mean? That's a steel bushing in there. This thing doesn't ride on bushing. What's going on? Bushing, this is what's going on, right? Push the actual pivot out the other side. Pivot's interesting. I'll get down to that and into that in a second, actually. Pull the blade out. You can see the bearings there. It is the single track bearing. But what this is doing is it works like a Benchmade 87. Because if you're familiar with the way that the 87 works, is it's taking the actual frame out of the equation as far as tensioning. Because this is the way most titanium integrals are constructed. This is a Benchmade 781 Anthem. And when you squeeze these screws, right, they're sitting on the outside of this titanium. So when you squeeze the screws down, you're squeezing the actual titanium, that inner track. You're actually collapsing the channel here down onto the blade and onto the bearings, right? You don't have to do that with that Anthem there. It's fitted well enough, it's made well enough that you don't actually have to put any tension on it. But this relieves that from the whole system. Because when you actually put tension on the hardware, right, you can imagine this hardware is collapsing down. It's squeezing this through this scale and just up against this one side. And so that actually takes the frame of the knife out of the equation as far as tension, as far as actually tensioning the pivot. And so that's just fascinating. As well, on the inside of this knife here, there's no bearing race, right? There's no actual bearing track. The bearings themselves are sitting right up against the actual titanium. They're made actually up against the inside of that titanium frame. And what that leads to is you can hear all those little dings and all those little dents and imperfections that have actually come from the bushing itself riding up and against that frame. What I was talking about with this hardware, right? Check out this hardware. That is the actual milled outside. You can see the actual, Zermascus inlay, whatever it is, on the hardware. And this actually threads off. So it's a double pivot system on this actual hardware, which I just think is fascinating. I'm not actually too familiar with it. If I can get this thing to freaking thread back on there for me, right? So that's neat. I like the way that that's done, as well as it's D-shaped. That aids in so much. Thank you so much, MidnightCat Studios, for giving us a D-shaped pivot. I really appreciate that one. So take this thing, slide it back into place, and then I'll take my bearing race. Well, I don't even know what to call this. Bearing race, bushing. I don't know what to call that. Slide it down into its little hole. Make sure it's sitting flush. You can imagine the amount of tolerances that have to go on in the actual manufacture of a knife like this, because you've got the fitment of this bushing to the actual scale itself, the fitment, the bushing itself, the depth of the bushing has to be absolutely perfect to maintain good tolerances. This is not an easy thing to manufacture, not an easy thing to produce. But I'm just going to slide my pivot back up into place. Make sure everything's sitting. I'm going to squish that piece of metal back down. Make sure everything's sitting flush. And I can take my screw and put it back in the hole. Come on, go in there. No, it doesn't want to thread. Come on. Freaking ridiculous shit. Take it all the way down, a little bit of tension off. I can pull the my little chopstick out of there. So what I'll do is test for blade wobble. No blade wobbles. The blade drop free. Blade drops free. Perfect, right? Good back, working back in order. That's one screw to take this entire knife apart. That is a seriously upgraded bush or bearing pivot system. I am a big fan of that. That does multiple things. You get the bearing track on the inside of this knife, as well as the actual, as well as just the overall the lifespan that you're going to get from actually having the titanium running up against, or having the bearings running up against steel opposed from titanium. I definitely appreciate that, as well as the inside track of this knife, right? Because you can see the way that this is milled out. It's rounded, right? It's at a radius. And I'd never thought about this until I was actually looking at this knife, and I think, honestly, if I had to guess a reason that they did that, I would guess aesthetics, because it just looks really good. It's beautiful, right? But as well as it's going to aid in overall structural stability, because if you're familiar with most integrals, a lot of integrals here, not most of them, well, yeah, probably most of them, but they're flat, right? There's a 90-degree transition to the back to the actual side scale there. There's a 90-degree angle change there. And so any tension, any squeezing of these scales together, any forcing them apart is all going to be right there at that 90-degree angle. That's going to be your weak point, right? That's going to be your point of fracture, is that 90-degree bend in the material. You don't have that with this design. With this rounded channel here, you don't have that 90-degree angle, right? And so it's still going to bend, if you squeeze this thing together hard enough, it's still going to bend in that particular spot. But it gives you a lot of structural rigidity, actually having that rounded channel cut into the frame of the knife itself, which I just think is absolutely beautiful, as well as, yeah, that gives a lot of structural stability. I definitely like that. Excuse me, I got off track, forgot what I was talking about. The blade shape, I definitely like this blade shape. It is reminiscent of the Amber 1, except for it doesn't have all of the crazy milling and the fuller there. It's not quite as pointy, but you can see the different, family similarity there. Honestly, I don't know which one I would take more. The more robust tip here, it's actually got, you can see it drops down a little bit further. Get that thing off camera. It actually drops down a little bit further to give you a little bit thicker, more reinforced tip, but it's still really pointy. And that is a classic spear point design. Because if you cut off right there on the blade, you can see that profile. The spine of the knife is the same. Is that the same curvature as the actual belly of the knife, right? The actual cutting edge of the knife. And so that's a traditional spear point tip. I definitely like it. That's a good utility work. It'll do utility. It's good for fighting, if you actually have to stab this into soft material, somebody's soft material, you know what I mean? It's going to do its job. A 4-inch blade as well. It's a longer blade than the original. I want to say the original is probably 3.7, something like that. 3.7 inches. If I can actually get that to line up. It's longer. This is 3.98, I want to say, like something like that. 3.9-inch blade, M390. Beautiful. Beautifully done blade. I like the name, too. This is the Amber 2. It's got a whole lot of crap on it. The actual Zermaskus here is interesting, right? Because I watched the development of this knife. I actually watched, I liked the Amber 1 so much, That's actually the reason I started following Midnight Cat on Instagram. Check him out on Instagram if you're not familiar with it. He's got a lot of really cool knives on his Instagram page. But the actual, I was watching the development of this thing, right? I thought it was just going to be an entire, an integral amber, right? That's cool enough. You give you the integral amber. For the price point that this thing comes in, $320, if you had this pocket clip made in the United States, right? If you actually had this thing manufactured in the U.S. and then milled out and sold as an individual pocket clip, right? Not on a knife, but you bought this pocket clip just by itself. It's going to be a $120 pocket clip. That's an expensive piece of material right there. It's very showy. That's not cheap, as well as the actual inlay here on the hardware itself. There's not a whole lot of that Zermaskus on this knife, but the parts that are, that's a 3D milled piece of Zermaskus right there, and you can get this knife for under $400. This is like a $320 knife, right? And I mean, that's a lot of money. It's definitely a lot of money, but for the amount of work, for the amount of perfection that's actually executed in this design, I freaking love how this finish is. It's just beautiful, right? You're getting a lot for your money with this thing. I definitely appreciate it, as well as the contour of the handle here, right? Because if you look at it flat on with this matte finish, it looks flat. You think that that's just going to be flat, but it's actually not. There's curvature here. It curves out towards the end of the spine. You can see a little bit of an indentation, and then it swells up towards the center of the knife. The actual center of the handle recesses back down and then swells up again towards the front. And so that gives you multiple things. It's going to aid in actual stopping protection as well as retracting protection. Just that little tiny bit of swell right there does actually help, as well as it functions very ergonomically in my hand. It kind of gives my fingers a place to sit, a little bit of orientation. I definitely know where I'm at on this knife. I love this finish. I just got to talk about it. I'm sitting here rubbing it in my hand. I freaking love bead blasted titanium. All bead blasted titanium, right? This is a Chris Reeves and Kosa. You can see the size of the media that they used here to give you this finish is a lot larger media on this Kosa than it would be on this this Amber 2 here, right? And so it's finer. It's almost got like a velvety, smooth type finish. I definitely appreciate it. This is a what is this thing? This is a Spyderco Endura, right? And this is also bead blasted titanium. You can see it's a lot smoother. There's not nearly as much of that texture. It's not quite as rough. And so I definitely, bead blasted titanium is my favorite finish for an overall knife handle, and I just love this silky smooth finish that's on this knife. It's absolutely beautiful. You can see it does mark up just like a Sebenza, just like an Kosa here. It definitely does mark up. That's my pen beating into the back of the actual spine of this knife, as well as I wanted to mention the tension on the lock bar, right? Somebody was complaining about how the lock bar tension is too strong. And I can actually, getting in here and actually relieving that, because it is flat, there is no recess, that's a negative. You know what I mean? I can't get my thumb in there. It is kind of hard to jam my finger in there. And there is a lot of lock bar tension in this overall design, right? But that's a good thing, because I can shake this thing down twice. It still drops free. Once I pull that actual lock bar tension off, it is, it's running on ball bearings. It is a free dropper. But that actual pressure from the lock bar being squeezed up against the blade stalls it out just a little bit. I don't get that guillotine effect from this thing actually slamming down. Where is it at? This is a Maxace Zerg, right? If I flip this thing closed, you can see it just falls right shut. And that's due to a couple things. This is an inset liner lock, so the lock itself doesn't have, as much strength, and then the blade is just this giant chunk of freaking steel. And so it's heavy, it's going to fall a lot easier. Some people prefer that. Some people prefer a little bit more stalled out. I definitely like that stronger lock bar, because it gives you a better detent as well. It gives you a better longevity on the overall knife, right? It's the same thing with this Chris Reeves Sebenza here. If I actually take that lock bar tension off, you can see that blade just drops free. But I, actually leave the tension on the lock bar, and I got to shake this thing quite hard to actually get it to close, and it's all just tension generated actually by the lock bar up against the side of the knife, and that is what's giving you your lockup, and so more tension equals a more secure lock. Lighter tension gives you a lighter detent and a free dropper, but it's not as secure in the actual overall lockup. Now, that's not across the board, but that is generally speaking when you're talking about titanium frame locks, and this thing here is no different. So I like this one. I don't know which one I like more. If I had to pick, I'm going to carry this more. I'm going to carry the Amber 2 more because it's just a little bit less showy. You know, this seems more like a suit knife, like a, you know, high-end, every once in a while kind of thing. I think this is probably just going to make it straight up into my EDC lineup. So, decisions. Maxace&midnightcat Studios, Amber 2. Zermaskus. It's got a little mushroom on it. Check out the mushroom. I got a mushroom on my pocket clip. Yeah. Y'all have a good one.